Welcome to Far East Wargaming, bringing you another Heresy Thursday. I'm Richard, your host, and once again joining me is Jason.
Hello everyone, glad to be back once again.
And this week we're bringing you another Legion review, and we are looking at the 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons, the Sons of Magnus the Psychic in our 30k universe.
Yeah, this is another fun one that I've been looking forward to reviewing. It is a Legion that actually has a little bit of a nice spot in my heart, mostly because of the modeling, just the kind of the story, the lore behind them, and the tragedy of what happened to them in 30k. But I do not believe that Magnus was not wrong. I think he was in the wrong, but we'll talk about that in just a minute.
Yes, as they're famous for the burning of Prospero, one of the legendary events that took place in the 30k between the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves, where the Space Wolves were sent to punish or to sanction the Thousand Sons there. Very iconic battle, and also so iconic we had a box set named after it, which was in the 1.0 version. We've not had one in the 2.0 though.
Yeah, it's again, it's a kind of a tragedy in many ways what happened to the Thousand Sons, and just very quickly from a lore perspective, obviously they were messing around with psychic shenanigans that the Emperor didn't really want them to mess around with. We had, the Edict of Nicaea, which banned things like librarians, and then we had Magnus foolishly trying to warn the Emperor of Horus's, traitor intentions, and that happened to destroy the Webway project that was being worked on underneath Earth. So yeah, a lot of things going on there. It is a very cool Legion. It's debatable how good it is in 30k, but we'll dive into the rules in just a minute.
Yes, and as with all the Legions, we always start with their Legion trait, and for the Thousand Sons, that is called Cult Arcana. All models with the infantry or cavalry type, but not those of artillery or automated artillery subtype, with this special rule gain the Psyker subtype. This does not grant any disciplines, but does not otherwise remove any disciplines from a model that already has access to them. In addition, all the models with the infantry and cavalry unit types and the character subtype that has this special rule may select one minor arcana option from the Prosperine Arcana special rule. Any model with the infantry and cavalry unit types and both independent character and Legion Astartes Thousand Sons special rule that does not already have one or more psychic disciplines may be upgraded for an additional 15 points to gain a single psychic discipline from the core psychic disciplines list there. So this is basically giving access to the psychic powers to most of the force, especially their Legion specific psychic powers.
Yeah, so we'll talk about the Prosperine Arcana in just a minute. They are a form of psychic abilities. They're not full-fledged psychic disciplines, but you see from the Legion rule that independent characters can, however, spend the 15 points to upgrade and get a psychic discipline. What this basically means is all of your units have the capability, for the most part, obviously not your vehicles or the artillery, the other things that were mentioned. Almost all of your units have the ability to get some sort of bump in performance, but we'll talk about just how good those are. It's debatable. But even more importantly, you can turn any of your independent characters into psychers if you want for very cheap at only 15 points. Yeah, it does open up a lot of different combinations and shenanigans that the Thousand Sons can pull off, but we'll talk about the Arcana in just a moment because it's not necessarily as great as you would initially think.
Yes, well, opening up independent characters to psychic, especially with the changes to the psychic phase, which is no longer a phase in 2.0 and happens at any given time depending on the psychic power you've chosen there, could make them quite powerful, and it means there's a lot of combination, which also implies that this is not a very beginner-friendly force, because you have to have a very good understanding of the rules and how they all interact with each other.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. I mean, my own experience in playing the Thousand Sons, but I only started playing in 2.0, has been that I very often do forget certain rules, certain interactions, or just plain just forget to do something. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's not beginner friendly in that regard. And if you want to get the most out of this army, because it is not necessarily considered one of the top tier armies, we'll talk about certain scenarios in a moment in which it is very good. To really get the most out of it, you do have to put in some extra work that you wouldn't say with a more straightforward legion like, I don't know, World Eaters or something like this.
Very true. So, moving on from their Legion special rule, we'll move on to their Legion Advance reaction. And the advance reaction for the Thousand Suns is called Fortress of the Mind. This advance reaction may be made once per battle during the opposing player's shooting phase when an enemy unit declares a shooting attack targeting a unit under the reactive player's control, made up entirely of Legion Astartes Thousand Suns models and Psyker subtype. Once the active player has resolved all 2-hit and 2-wound rolls, but before any armor saves are made, the reactive player must make a psychic check. If the check is passed, the reacting unit gains a 3+ invulnerable save against all wounds inflicted as part of the shooting attack that triggered this reaction. If the check is failed, then the reacting unit only gains a 5+ invulnerable save, and both the attacking unit and the reacting unit suffer from Perils of the Warp, removing any casualties immediately before resolving any unsaved wounds inflicted by the shooting attack that triggered this reaction. So a bit of a long-winded one, but what really sums up is you're getting the ability to have an invulnerable save to any shooting attack regardless of passing or failing. It really just depends on how good the invulnerable save is. And the downside is actually double-edged, which is quite unique.
Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty good advanced reaction. The problem is that unless you've got a unit that has like Leadership 9, Leadership 10, you have basically about a 1/3 chance of failing this, right? So for example, if you're putting it on a unit of a heavy support squad, which you may want to, save from a round of shooting or something like this, 3-up invuln, very good, but if you fail, you're going to take a Perils, you're only going to get a 5-up invuln, but you are going to trigger a Perils on the whatever shot at you, which is kind of good. Again, as is the case with many of the psychic abilities, the Cult Arcana, the Prospering Arcana, that the Thousand Suns have, the lower leadership in 2.0 really makes a lot of this stuff more risky than it was in the past. And consistently triggering, Perils of the Warp on your own army over the course of a 6-turn game, 4-turn game, 5-turn game adds up to a lot of extra casualties for no reason. So that's one of the things that actually lets this advanced reaction down, right? I mean, again, it's not that the reaction itself is so bad. It's that leadership is down in 2.0, therefore more chances to Perils, and you're already going to be probably doing that a few times a game.
You're right. I still think it's one of these reactions that will get used nearly every game because there's always one unit you want to save from the new meta, the Las Cannon meta, or the Volkite meta, or just in general the things that are bypassing your normal save and requiring an invul save. And for units, like you mentioned, the heavy support squads, they don't get an inherent invulnerable save. So if you're being targeted by an enemy Las Cannon squad and your own Las Cannon squad is being targeted, which is kind of the tit-for-tat targets that you are going for nowadays, and expecting to kill some of theirs, get return fired in return, you're coming out on top most of the time because a 3+ invul, if you do get that psychic check off, is a very powerful thing to save, 2/3 of your models.
Yeah, I mean, again, in certain circumstances, it can be very good, right? So let me give you an example. If you got a Praetor in a command squad and you happen to stick them either in standard armor, Artificer armor, getting access to a 3-up invuln at a critical junction, that's actually a very good thing, right? And your Praetor is already Leadership 10, so the chances of the Perils is much less. That's one good example. If you've got the aforementioned heavy support squad, like you mentioned, and you happen to stick a Master of Signals or another Delegatus, a Siegebreaker or something with it, Leadership 9, again, getting the 3-up invuln is going to be really, really useful and more powerful than a 5-up Shroud, right? Another little interesting combo is the Osiren Dreadnought, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But because it has the Psyker subtype and Legion Astartes Thousand Suns, all of a sudden popping a 3-up invuln on one of your Contemptors can ruin somebody's day as well if they're planning on taking it out. So again, it's not so much that it's a bad advanced reaction. I think it's actually pretty good. It's just not as good as it could be because, again, we'll talk about it in just a moment. You're going to have lots of Perils typically when you're playing Thousand Suns, and I've had some games where I've had as many as 6 or 7 times that happened.
Well, speaking of the things that trigger these perils, we have the Prosperine Arcana, which is what you get to choose for your character subtypes in your normal infantry and cavalry there. And there are 5 of them. There is the Raptora, Pyre, Pavoni, Corvidae, and Antheon. I think I pronounced those all correctly. They're all very different, I'd say, even though there is, I think, some overlap in between a couple of them. The first one we'll start with is the Raptora, and I think this is one a lot of people take. When a unit that includes a Psyker with this power is selected to make a move or run move during their controlling player's movement phase that ends within 12 inches of an enemy unit, the controlling player may make a Psychic check for the Psyker with this power before any model in the units are moved. If the Psychic check is successful, then all models gain a 6+ invul, or if they already have an invul, they increase their invul by +1 to a maximum of +4 until the start of the controlling player's next turn. If the Psychic check is failed, you suffer Perils of the Warp here. I think you're putting this on units that are already having their invuls and that can increase, mainly Tartarus Terminators, or if you do have them, the 40k Terminator Mark armor, the Indominus pattern type armor, which doesn't have an already 4+ invul save, because on Cataphracti these are pretty useless except for the movement, you know, only getting that benefit there. I think that on a normal unit, a 6+ invul is also kind of a waste.
Yeah, I agree with you. So definitely you're going to put this on Tartarus, whether it's just regular Tartarus squads or command squads and Tartarus armor to get them to that juicy 4-up invuln. You can also put this on things like assault squads with combat shields. Is a very nice combo, because all of a sudden now your assault squad, if it triggers this by doing the movement or the run within 12 inches of the enemy, they get a tasty 5-up invuln instead of a 6-up from the combat shields. And there's a few other units like command squads and maybe some others that are slipping my mind that can get access to combat shields as well. And again, getting up to that 5-up. Another one where I could see this being used on is if you've got a unit with a Delegatus, and a Delegatus only has a refractor field 5-up. Okay, now you can get him to a 4-up even if he's in power armor or artificer armor, as it were. So yes, there's only a few units that are really going to benefit out of this, and I do agree with you that a 6-up invuln in general is not the greatest thing in the world. Again, almost all of these Prosperine Arcana are very specific that you're going to use on certain units, and that's what kind of lets them down a little bit, because again, it's only going to be certain units that'll get the benefit. The last thing that I'll point out about this particular Arcana is if you're stuck in combat, you don't get to trigger it. So even if you've got your Tartarus command squad, and I've had this happen to me, I triggered it successfully when I moved up. I charged in for whatever reason. We stuck. We didn't kill the opponent, or we didn't bounce off. But then all of a sudden in that next round of combat, because I haven't moved or run, again, I'm going to be going back down to my default 5-up. So you just need to be careful with this, because you don't want to get yourself stuck in a situation where you were counting on that extra bonus to the invuln and all of a sudden to have it go away.
All very true points. So it's not all upsides for these. There are sometimes some downsides. And again, I think, like I said at the beginning, this is one where you have to kind of watch the wording of the rules pretty specifically, because this ends at the start of the controlling player's next turn. There are some psychic powers that don't overlap, or that are very similar, that give bonuses but end at the end of your turn. And so it's kind of hard to keep track. And I know we've done in the past, in our own battle reports, we've made that mistake in some of them, because it just is a lot of bookkeeping for psychic powers.
Agreed. And just one comment I'll make here before we talk about the other Arcana, just in general, like we said earlier, it's a more complex army to play. Make it easy on yourself. Make it easy on your opponent. Make some little tokens or something. I've got some that I'm going to place on order, actually, that's going to mark all these different kinds of things. But it'll help you to remember. It'll also help your opponent to remember and have a much more smoother game if you can mark these kinds of things.
Well, the second Prosperine Arcana is called Pyre. When a charge is declared for a unit that includes a Psyker with this power, the controlling player may make a psychic check for the Psyker with this power before any dice are rolled to determine if the charge is successful. If the psychic check is passed, then all models in the charging unit with the Psyker subtype and Thousand Suns special rules gain the Hammer of Wrath 2 special rule, with all hits inflicted by this Hammer of Wrath counting as flame attacks. If the check is failed, they suffer the Perils of the Warp as usual. This one I don't see people using as much because Hammer of Wrath really isn't that great when your base strength is only 4. It's an automatic hit, so you're rolling to wound, but still, I guess if you have a large enough unit, it might be worth it.
Yeah, this one's just a big blech. I never take this just because, not because it's so bad, although it is bad in my opinion. It's just because things like Raptora or a couple of the others are going to be more preferable. I mean, let's face it, you know, even if you put this on a unit of, I don't know, Assault Marines, you didn't want to do the Raptora and you wanted to do the Pyre, you're already getting Hammer of Wrath with the jump packs. I mean, bumping it up to Hammer of Wrath 2, okay, great. That's a few extra attacks. But let's be honest, realistically, most times when you're charging in, you're probably averaging 5 or 6 guys that are getting into base to base. Against regular Marines, you're wounding on a 4, so you're going to maybe get 4 or 5 wounds that sneak through. And then even if they're in regular power armor, they're only going to fail maybe 1, possibly 2. So again, that's very rough math, but it just isn't worth it in my opinion in comparison to the others. Again, Raptora is going to be better on anything that you want to bump up the invuln, and we'll talk about the others on why you're going to probably take that instead of Pyre.
Yeah, mainly because of the way that Hammer of Wrath works right there. It's only those in base-to-base contact. And with the way we play, or I think just the way games are played in general, it's hard to get a lot of guys in base-to-base contact in the first turn, and you tend to be getting them wrapping around or piling in the second turns for more base-to-base, because our engagement range is actually so far. So you don't actually have to be there to get your normal attacks. Them being flame as well, I think is very flavorful. I actually think it's a downside, to be honest, because it for some of the units it lowers lowers the strength. If you're going against the salamanders, you're getting -1 to your strength coming into that flame attack. So that Hammer of Wrath is suddenly even more useless there.
Agree.
The third Prosperine Arcana is called Pavoni, and I think it's one you'll see played a bit more. When a unit that includes a Psyker with this power is selected to make a move or a run move during the controlling player's movement phase, the controlling player may make a Psychic check for the Psyker with this power before any models are moved. If the check is successful, then all models in the moving unit with this Psyker and Legion Astartes Thousand Suns special rules gains a +3 to the distance and may ignore any penalties to difficult terrain during the movement phase. If the psychic check is failed, they suffer Perils of the Warp here. This is one to get your boys down the field very quickly, and it also, I believe, works in conjunction with the charge, suddenly making your movement 7 into a movement 10, which puts you into a +1 for charging, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, actually, I'll correct that because it specifically states that it's for the movement phase only. The end of that sentence where it talks about +3 to the distance moved, ignore any penalties for moving through difficult terrain during the movement phase only. So I've never played it as adding +1 to my charge. I do play it exactly as it's written because I think that's what was intended. I like this on certain units, once again, like Cataphracti. I love getting another 3-inch move out of Cataphracti who can't normally run. So that's a good thing. Breachers could get some use out of this. Even your basic TAC Marines all of a sudden have a movement 10 for the phases that this goes off on. So this is one that I like better than Pyre for that reason, because movement is king in 30k, and especially if you're playing something like Zone Mortalis, this becomes a very useful Cult Arcana for that. Same downside as any of the Arcana, I won't go into details, which is against things that have only a leadership 8 or 7, you have a very high chance of Perils just when you try to get this thing off. And I have seen things like my Sekhmet or my regular Cataphracti unfortunately fail and then take a couple wounds and lose a model.
Yeah. In terms of it not including, you're right, it can be read that way. I can understand people reading it just saying the difficult terrain penalty is only for the movement phase. Yeah, all valid points there. I think a clarification potentially from GW would clear that up 100%, but play it as you agree with your opponent there.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I lean this direction is if you look at the other Cult Arcana or some of the psychic abilities, they specifically say until the start of the opponent's next turn or till the end of the opponent's next turn. This one says nothing about it. It says very specific movement phase. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Some people can interpret or read it differently because of the vague nature of English sometimes, but I'm playing it pretty much as it doesn't affect your charge distance.
Now, the fourth Prosperine Arcana is Core Vidai. When a unit that includes a Psyker with this power makes a shooting attack, the controlling player may make a Psychic check for the Psyker with this power before any to-hit rolls are made. If the check is successful, then the first wound scored on the target unit by the shooting attack is allocated by the Psyker's controlling player, but once this model has been removed as a casualty, any further wounds are allocated as per normal. If the Psychic check is failed, once again they suffer Perils of the Warp.
Yep, this is useful obviously on heavy support squads. If you've got a squad of missile launchers or you've got a squad I'll stick with missile launchers. You can stop the opponent from tanking on Artificer armor, at least for the first wound, right? So I shoot, and then maybe I use this power if it goes off successfully, and instead of allowing that first wound to be tanked by the sergeant, I force the AP3 to be taken by the Vexilla or the Nuncio Vox or the Augury Scanner guy who's probably in only armor of a 3-up power armor. So it's useful for that reason. Even on a las cannon squad, it's useful to use it that way. But on any other kinds of squads that have average to poor AP, forcing that first wound to be taken on a different model isn't necessarily going to work most of the time because a 3-up is still a decent save, right? But it does have its uses with certain units. I've only used this in very specific circumstances, and mostly on what I mentioned. If I might have another squad, for example, that's carrying a meltagun, I don't know, veterans, something like this, you could use it in that particular case to force that meltagun to be on the Artificer armor, so you could snipe out a character potentially or an independent character that way.
Yep, I think it's really used for sniping out the independent character, sniping out the Praetor of a command squad there by getting an instant death weapon. Yes, he still has an invul, but if he fails his invul, he's dead, as opposed to getting it taken by ablative wounds around him, which could have some recurring effects in certain forces when they lose their warlord there, and also the extra points in most of our games. So yes, it is a nice one. I think it is also one that isn't used all the time, so you won't have to take that many checks, but can come pivotal, and I think might be worth taking those checks.
Yep, absolutely.
The final Prosperine Arcana is Athenaean, I'll call it. When a unit that includes a Psyker with this power makes a shooting attack, the controlling player may make a Psychic check for the Psyker with this power before any to-hit rolls are made, or reactions declared. If the Psychic check is successful, then the enemy unit targeted by this shooting attack must reduce the leadership characteristic of all models in the unit by 1 for any pinning tests or morale checks caused by the shooting attack. If the Psychic check is failed, Perils of the Warp are suffered. This one's potentially really good in like those scenarios where you need to get a pinning check going.
Yeah, there's some good combos for this, but again, it's going to be very narrow. Snipers. So your recon squad, your scout squad with Nemesis bolters, you're going to be triggering the pinning check anyhow if you get a successful wound through with those sniper rifles, those Nemesis bolters. Adding additional -1 to the leadership when that pinning check is done could be downright vicious. If you're playing at night, all of a sudden that tac squad or most regular squads with leadership 8 sergeants, they're going to be checking on a 6. So you have a pretty high chance of actually pinning, so that's pretty decent. Another combo that I've actually tried this with is rotor cannons, which are not the greatest things in the world for support squads, but a weapon with shell shock plus this ability plus at night you potentially have somebody testing on a 5 for that pin check. not bad. So I would rather take this than Pyre, for example. It's decent, but again, it's going to be only used on very, very, very specific units, and you got to kind of build the combo around it. Once again, on leadership 8 or 7, you're going to have a higher chance of doing the Perils, and that's the running theme for all of these Cult Arcana. You just have to watch out for that.
I think all in all, the fact that there are 5 different ones that can do relatively different things, but are all situational, means that a smart building of a list could utilize nearly all of them at the right scenario. Maybe not Pyre, I think that one actually will never really be used, but all the other 4 I can definitely see used by various units in a force, and they don't all have to take the same, which is I think the biggest bonus there. So you can give your Cataphracti the extra movement, whilst giving your Tartarus the extra save ability, whilst giving your snipers the extra pinning, or giving your heavy support squad the ability to get an invul or just allocate the first wound there. I like it. Very flavorful. Again, just a lot of bookkeeping to track which units have which, especially if you're running tactical squads or all of the same type of unit, but they're not all running the same Prosperine Arcana. If all 3 of your tactical squads are running different Arcanas, how to keep track of, oh, this one here is on the left side, this one's down the middle, this one's on the right. It does get a bit taxing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, just for my own mental health, usually when I'm running all tac squads, I pretty much have all of them on Pavoni just to get the extra distance. But yeah, you're right. It is more bookkeeping, and it does also require a lot more thinking on your list building if you're trying to take advantage of these. My biggest complaint, again, about the Cult Arcana is you're going to Perils every game. Every game. And this is kind of where the Thousand Sons Legion is let down by its rules, because giving free wounds to your opponent every single game on what's supposed to be a Legion trait or strength, it's kind of it's a feels bad, to be quite honest with you, right? I have never had a single game without a single Perils. I've had some games where I might have had only 2 or 3, and I say only 2 or 3 because that could still result in potentially up to 9 dead models if they're 1 wound models. I've had other games where I perilled 6, 7, 8 times, just constantly doing Perils. So I wish that they had tweaked these a little bit different. Maybe saying something along the lines of, these Prosperine Arcana, are always tested on a leadership 9 to represent the psychic might of the Thousand Sons. Let the other psychic checks, psychic abilities be Perils as normal, but do something different, because again, just giving free wounds away to your opponent, there's been plenty of games where I intentionally never used the Cult Arcana because I was so worried that killing off some of my models was going to dramatically swing the game in a different situation. And to me, that just kind of sucks. Bad rule design.
Look, all very valid points. Pros and cons for the Thousand Sons player. I think that really is what it's trying to achieve there, a bit of balance whilst making it not too strong. But yeah, increasing their leadership for turn 9. I think you're right. The main problem is the drop in leadership in general we've had in the 2.0 update, which has made all leadership checks a lot harder. That even just that drop of 1 leadership is already making the difference.
Yep, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, to those of you that are listening, I'm not actually whining about the Thousand Sons, because there are some circumstances, some certain games, and some certain lists that you can build with the Thousand Sons, which are actually pretty freaking brutal. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But again, you don't want to be one-dimensionally building your armies into just those power builds. But yeah, I mean, again, I won't keep going on and on about this, but just, yeah, the leadership really can hurt you sometimes.
So moving on, let's look at the Warlord traits. And we have 3 Warlord traits. Only one of them is allegiance specific, traitor specific, and that is the first one, the Evoker of Pain, which is traitor only. When a Warlord with this trait fails a psychic check and suffers a Perils of the Warp, neither the Warlord nor any models in the unit that it has joined suffer any wounds. Instead, select one enemy unit that has at least one model within 6 inches of the Warlord with this trait, or is locked in combat with the Warlord. This unit suffers D3 wounds against which only invulnerable saves may be made and no damage mitigation rolls may be made. If there is no valid unit within 6 inches, then resolve the Perils of the Warp against the Warlord's unit as normal. Wounds inflicted in this manner during the assault phase do not count for resolving the winner of combat and never cause morale checks or pinning checks. In addition, you get an additional reaction in the assault phase.
Fluffy, good. No, I'm sorry, it's not. I mean, again, you know, being able to mitigate a Perils of the Warp, that sounds great in theory, but because it's only really going to be useful against an enemy within 6 inches, it's just, it's not that, it's very situational, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And you're going to play an entire game more often than not where this Warlord trait never comes into effect. And then the icing on top of the poo flavored cake is that you get an extra assault phase reaction, which is probably going to be the least useful, you know, versus shooting number 1, movement number 2. Yeah, not a big fan of this one, and I've never taken it in a single list that I've built.
Well, it does come off as extremely appealing because all of the downsides we talked about and those Perils of the Warp suddenly being shifted automatically to an opponent does sound pretty cool and might make you want to fail one of your Perils of the Warp checks or your psychic checks just to take out some of the stronger units there. But you're right, it is only 6 inches, so how often is your Warlord in close combat for the Thousand Suns, even though most of the time they will be wielding weapons with force, which again is another psychic check, but with no downside, I believe, there for it, which doubles your strength, moving you to mainly instant death territory, potentially not at unwieldy initiative of 1. I don't know. If you were playing super aggressive and you had a death ball, which was going to be in the middle, I think it might be worth it. But again, you're building your force or you're building your list around dropping this guy in the middle of combat. And there are so many other legions with such good close combat abilities that you probably won't survive too long.
Yeah, but again, I mean, because your Warlord is either going to be leadership 10 or leadership 9, I mean, how many checks are you going to fail, even if you are within 6 inches, unless you've got something like fear or night fighting or whatever affecting the leadership. Again, it's just so situational that it doesn't come up very often, and I just don't see the value, to be honest with you.
Well then, the second Warlord trait is Magister of Prospero. A Warlord with this trait and any model with the Legion Astartes Thousand Suns special rule in a unit it joins that makes psychic checks, such as when using Force or Psychic Focus special rules, may roll an additional dice and discard the highest rolled dice before determining the result of the check. In addition, the army gets an additional movement phase reaction here. So this is the one to help that one unit, though, just pass those psychic checks a bit better.
Yeah, this is a good one. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not top tier Warlord traits, but it's one that I take quite frequently. I mean, rolling that extra dice basically, you know, reduces your chances of a peril down near 0 on leadership 10. On leadership 9, you still have a single digit percentage chance. I don't remember exactly what it is. But yeah, I mean, it just kind of protects your Warlord and the unit that he's with against the perils. But where it stops it from being even high mid-tier of Warlord traits is you're not getting any output out of it. It's a preventative. It's not an output. And most Warlord traits are doing something else, like pinning to your weapons, or giving you a strength bonus, or, you know, doing something else like that, where this is really more like a just in case. Again, flavorful. It's similar to, I think, the 1.0 rule where they had ways to mitigate Perils of the Warp, and I still take this one a lot, but it's definitely mid-tier, in my opinion, as far as Warlord traits go.
That brings us to the third Warlord trait, and that is Eidolon of Suffering. A Warlord with this trait may not use psychic powers or psychic weapons, but gains the Adamantium Will 3+ special rule. When another model, friendly or enemy, makes a psychic check within 12 inches of the Warlord, the controlling player must roll a d6. On the score over 1, there is no effect. On the score of a 2 or higher, the Warlord gains a Rage 2 special rule for the remainder of the battle. If this trait would grant Rage 2 a further time, then instead you increase the value by +1 up to a maximum of Rage 4. In addition, the opponent gains an additional reaction in the shooting phase, which is the phase we all like.
Yeah, this is a mixed bag. Where it's good, let me cover that first. Psychic checks within 12 inches of the Warlord, those are going to happen a lot in most Thousand Sons armies, so it's virtually guaranteed that you're going to get Rage 2, potentially going up to Rage 3, going up to Rage 4, which will obviously help you if you're a melee type unit and a melee type Warlord. So yes, that's a good thing. Additional shooting phase reaction, yes, that's a very, very good thing. Big downside, you can't use psychic powers and you can't use psychic weapons. Psychic powers is something that you want to be using on your independent characters with high leadership. So that's a bit of a big downside. And Adamantium will 3-up. I mean, that's only going to help you against opposing psychic abilities. I mean, again, mixed bag. It's fluffy. I understand why it was written this way, because it kind of reflects those Thousand Sons that weren't as gifted or gifted at all versus their brothers, which was actually very uncommon, but it did happen. Yeah, not being able to use psychic abilities or psychic weapons is actually a pretty big deal, and that's why I don't like this one that much. But hey, if again you're building a specific list around a hard-hitting melee unit with the independent character and you don't really care about the fact that you can't use psychic abilities or psychic weapons, you can get some use out of this. But again, you just need to also have proper positioning within that 12 inches to force these rage opportunities to come up. Last point I'll make is this doesn't say anything about somebody making a successful or unsuccessful psychic check. It simply says a psychic check within 12 inches. So it doesn't matter whether that check is unsuccessful or not.
Yeah, so 3 Warlord traits, from the way we've discussed them, are a bit meh to describe it. Are you thinking that you mainly use the standard Warlord traits in a Thousand Sons list?
Yeah, I do, actually. So I use Magister of Prospero, I do use quite often because, again, just to guarantee that I can not Perils with my key units. I do obviously use the generic trait Stoic Defender quite a lot just to get the pinning plus the extra shooting phase reaction. So yeah, in comparison to other legions, their choices of Warlord traits are just not very good. In comparison, I'm saying. Some useful ones, but in comparison overall, I think lower tier.
Well, let's move on now to look at the Thousand Sons rights of war, and there are only 2 rights of war for the Thousand Sons, and the first one is the Achaean configuration. And the effects of this right of war is a detachment using this right of war may select Castellax Achaea Automata units as non-compulsory troop choice. Any model from a detachment using this right of war that is within 12 inches of a Castellax Achaea model and suffers perils of the warp may choose to allocate all of the wounds inflicted by perils of the warp to the Castellax Achaea model. A Castellax Achaea model in a detachment using this right of war is considered to have the line subtype as long as that model is within 6 inches of a friendly Legion Astartes Thousand Sons model with the Psyker subtype. The limitations for this right of war is any Castellax Achaea Autonoma city unit selected as troops must include more than 1 model. A detachment using this right of war must include at least 1 Legion Tech Marine Covenant, and a detachment using this right of war must include at least 1 model with the Legion Consularis special rule that has been upgraded to a Legion Praevian.
So from a fluff perspective and a modeling perspective, I actually like this right of war a lot. I mean, from a fluff perspective, you have these psychic automatas that are running around and they're Castellax, and Castellax are not bad, and all of that is really cool, and the models from Forgeworld are really, really nice. So I like all of that. Getting them in the troop slot and having them gain line is one of the big strengths, I think, of this right of war, because, durable line units like those are really, really, really nice to have. The problem is again, they're not cheap, the Castellax. So these Castellax Achaeas, I don't remember what the points are, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So allocating wounds to them, yes, you're saving your more expensive stuff, but you're obviously going to only put these next to your more expensive stuff because you're basically, you would almost rather tack Marines to die from a Perils than you would rather put the wounds onto the Castellax unless you're like on an objective or something. The other thing that lets this Rite of War down is that you got to take a Tech Marine, and you also have to take a Praevian. So there's a double whammy in terms of what's called the HQ tax, right? Because some of the other Legion Rites of War, they may say you need to take a Master of Signals or something like that. This is saying you got to take 2 extra characters. So you've got at least 200 points probably in the Praevian and the Tech Marine, and then you've got the cost of the Castellax. So at a bare minimum, taking this Rite of War, you've got like 500 to 600 points in sunk cost. And that's where it lets it down. But I do like the Castellax in gaining line. But that's a lot of points to pay to use this Rite of War, and you're certainly not going to be using it at lower points values.
Yep, it is a pretty expensive tax. On the positive side, I will say that even though the Castellax models are 140 each there, they have the Adamantine Will 4+, so you are saving on those Perils of the Warp, so there's a 50% chance of stopping some of those wounds. Additionally, as we've seen in some of our reports, battle reports there, the Legion Tech Marine is actually pretty strong when played in certain variations or certain ways, and so is the Praevian there. I think they're designed to just follow around and heal units, automata, and vehicles, but they can do more. They can be basically little Master of Signals there for certain units to get the additional ballistic skill. So if you're building I'd say a gun-heavy Thousand Suns line, this might actually not be too bad if you're throwing these guys in with your very close combat focused or actually expensive close combat units from the Thousand Suns into the middle there, and hoping to get their psychic powers off. Passing off that to the Castellax may be an idea. I do get it. I think it's very fluffy. Also, I think the models are these guys or variations of these guys in plastic yet?
No, they're not. So it's still Forgeworld. I mean, you can take the plastic Castellax and you can probably do some conversion, some sculpting or whatnot, and turn them into the Castellax Achaea version. But the actual model itself is still from Forgeworld. I don't want to jump ahead to the Achaea, but the other downside is the Achaea versus regular Castellax have some downsides, which is in the weapons. Regular Castellax can take things like multi-meltas, Darkfire Cannon. Castellax Achaea can only take a Etherfire Cannon or a Asphex Bolt Cannon, neither of which are anything special to write home about. So that is, again, a bit of a downside about this. But I do like durable bodies in the line that are in troop slots that gain line. So that, I think, is what I really like about this Rite of War, and all the other stuff is just kind of okay.
Well, the second Rite of War for the Thousand Suns is the Guard of the Crimson King. And the effects for this is the controlling player may designate up to 6 units from the detachment using this Rite of War that are made up entirely of models with the infantry unit type. These units gain the Deep Strike special rule. When these units are deployed as part of a Deep Strike assault, they gain the Fear 1 special rule for the duration of the turn in which they are deployed on the battlefield. Additionally, Sekhmet Cabals may be selected as troop choices for a detachment using this Rite of War. The limitations are the detachment must include either Magnus the Red, Ahriman, or a Legion Praetor, Legion Cataphracti Praetor, Legion Tartarus Praetor, upgraded to have a Psychic Discipline. This Rite of War may not use any allied detachments either there.
This is a very good Rite of War in a lot of different ways, and I'll explain why. So in a standard list, having 6 units being able to deep strike is insane, right? Because you're not going to need to have things like warmongers or assault squads. I mean, you can be deep striking basically so many different things. And then the fact that they gain Fear 1 on the turn that they come in you're potentially forcing leadership checks on 6s and 5s if you're playing at night when the deep strike comes in. Should the night fighting still be in effect in turn 2? That's in regular games. In Zone Mortalis, this Rite of War makes Thousand Sons, in my opinion, one of the best legions for Zone Mortalis. And I will die on that hill. Having played it and discovered this by accident, what makes this so good in Zone Mortalis is the combination of the deep strike affecting your reinforcement points. It's allowing 6 different units to actually come in cheaper, potentially on flanks or the rear of the enemy in Zone Mortalis. The segment as troops, again, that also plays very well into Zone Mortalis, where troops are cheaper to bring on from reinforcement points or to deploy. Now, all of a sudden, you've got heavy hitters, more heavy hitters in the troop slot. It's just so good in Zone Mortalis. And when I played that event that we had, and I was actually just running a very basic Thousand Sons list, but I happened to take this Rite of War. It was only my 3rd or 4th time to play with the Thousand Sons, and all of a sudden I was just rolling over people because I was consistently coming in the sides and the rear, and I was like, holy cow, this is so good. The limitations on this Rite of War essentially are none. Yes, you can't take it on an allies detachment. Well, great. I mean, that's very rare. Yes, you must take either Ahriman or Magnus or Legion Praetor. Well, you're going to be taking those almost all the time anyhow. So this essentially has no downsides. And that combination of deep striking and the way it works with Zone Mortalis, as well as the deep striking and the fear in regular games, in my opinion, make this a very, very good Rite of War. And it's definitely one to build your army around.
Yep, that combination in the Zone Mortalis games is something we both noticed when you were playing that. I was there running that event, and honestly, with the way I like the way Zone Mortalis has gone, I think it's a novel way of doing it. The reinforcement points, it means you have to think in advance in building your lists. And the crux has always been the number of reinforcement points you gain to bring in all your elites. And suddenly you've got elites coming in at even less because of the deep strike rules there. Very, very strong.
Yep, absolutely. And if I'm playing a Thousand Sons specific Rite of War, it's usually this. But I play a lot of generic ones as well. But again, I really like this Rite of War. I think it makes Thousand Sons very powerful in certain situations. And fight me, I think they're top tier in Zone Mortalis.
Well, let's move on from the Rite of Wars and look at the armory of the Thousand Sons. And there's quite a bit here. So we'll start with the first entry, which is the Etherfire Cannon. Any model with a special rule, a Thousand Sons special rule, may exchange a plasma pistol for an ether fire pistol, a plasma gun or plasma blaster for an ether fire blaster, a plasma cannon for an ether fire cannon, or a Gravis plasma cannon for an ether fire magna cannon, all for no additional points. These are all counted as plasma and force weapons for the effects of those rules. And really what it is doing is it's giving the 6+ rending and Aan Force special rules to some of these at the sacrifice of a bit of range.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of any of these, to be quite honest with you. I mean, flavorful, but in most cases, regular plasma guns, plasma blasters, plasma pistols, plasma cannons, they have a better breaching than Rending 6. And yes, you can argue that Rending is better than breaching in certain situations, but I'd rather have the much more reliability of the better breaching chance on the regular versions of these guns. All the Aan Force does is add +2 strength. I say all it does because it does take all these weapons up to strength 8, and that can be a nasty surprise. But again, your default is AP4, and you're only going to be rending on a 6. So that means in most cases, even if you trigger the Aan Force and get up to strength 8, the opponent is still going to get a save. The only thing is that you're going to bypass the instant death threshold for things like Feel No Pain. Not a big fan of any of these. They're fluffy. They also have differences in terms of the range. I could see maybe an excuse to use Etherfire blasters instead of plasma guns because it does turn them into Assault 2 weapons. But again, I'm sorry, I would just much rather have the better chance to breach than the Strength 8.
Yeah, you are losing the get hot from all the plasma, but with that you're losing its breaching ability there. Yeah, mixed bag here, because also the get hot isn't as bad nowadays with plasma weapons, because it's not instant killing your guys, because the inherent AP is lower and you never get the breaching on yourself. So yes, you can argue plasma guns have got weaker. They've got weaker with the downside of killing you a bit less as well. So yeah, mixed bag on the Etherfire here. Yeah, I've not played with them myself. I will delegate my the better opinion to those who have. If you've had some success with Etherfire cannons, let us know. Or if there's a combination with these that we might be missing because we've just not looked in depth enough at the combinations of how they work with the Thousand Suns, let us know in the comments.
Yeah, I mean, I guess probably one other thing that I would say is, you know, they have the Aan Force special rule. What does that mean in terms of if you're shooting these against things like demons, right? Because normally force weapons have a different effect on things with demonic subtype, right? I don't see anything in the Aan Force rule that actually says it's the equivalent of force. Now, whether that was an intentional change or an oversight, I have no idea. Let us know that in the comments as well, because Aan Force and force rules as written seem to be two different things with two different effects.
The second thing in the armory for the Thousand Suns is the XVth shells, and these have seen a change from the 1.0 versions. Any model with the Legion Astartes Thousand Suns special rule may exchange a bolt pistol for an XVth bolt pistol or a bolter for an XVth bolter for +1 point per weapon. And what you are getting, again, is reduced range for them, but you're getting the shred special rules.
Yeah, shred is not bad. I mean, obviously you get a chance to re-roll to wound. That's good. You are trading the range. It's debatable whether or not that's a good trade. If you're a bolter, Asphyx bolter, for example, you go from range 28 to 18. You're still rapid fire, which means you're only double tapping at 9 inches, but you're getting the benefit of shred. It costs 1 point to do this per weapon. Again, I'm not a big fan of this. Probably the only time that I've ever done this is I've sometimes upgraded bolt pistols on aggressive units because I know that they're going to actually be up in the opponent's face anyhow, and getting that shred, the lower range is not going to matter too much. So if I've got to spare 10 points on a 10-man squad or 15-man squad to go ahead and upgrade them, then yeah, I might do that because I already know they're going to be in the opponent's face. But you know, Asphyx bolt cannon going down to 24-inch range, I mean, I'd rather have the 36, and then in the bolters themselves. The other thing that I have a complaint about on this particular set of rules is, for whatever reason, rotor cannons didn't get this. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they did get access to Asphyx shells in 1.0. So why they didn't do that in 2.0, I have no idea. But maybe they thought the combination of shell shock and whatever else maybe was too much. But geez, I mean, shred on strength 3 weapons isn't exactly over the top, in my opinion.
Very true. I do remember them in 1.0 being very powerful, especially on the rotor cannons there. But I think they didn't give you a shred rule. I think in the 1.0 they gave you something more like rending, but I can't remember there. The next entry in the armory is the IKEA pattern force weapons, and all Thousand Suns character subtypes may exchange any of their power weapons for force weapons at no additional cost here. And what you're gaining for this is the Aan Force special rule, which we spoke about before here. And it's basically a psychic check for the ability to get a +2 strength to your attack. And there is no downside, because if you don't pass it, you don't take a Perils of the Warp here. So I think for most users, they are taking one of these.
Yeah, these are not bad. You know, basically what Aan Force says is that on the check, it's +2 strength, right? So now all of a sudden your force swords become strength 6, your axes become strength 7, and your force mauls become a nasty strength 8, which could be a nasty surprise for a lot of people. Yeah, I mean, this is probably one of the better parts of the armory, I would say. I can see a case for this on your squad sergeants. I can see a case for this on certain units that are made up of characters. You know, doing things like getting strength 8 for smalls. It's not bad, and since it doesn't cost any points, that makes it even more decent. So if you're already going to take a power axe on a sergeant, for example, then you might as well give him this for no reason. Same thing with the 4 small. Yeah, not bad, and pointed appropriately, in my opinion.
So that brings us to the end of the rules for the Thousand Suns here. And since there was quite a lot to talk about, I think we're going to break this up into 2 parts like we have with some of our previous Legion reviews, because they have quite a bit to talk about in terms of their special characters as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. We spent a lot of time talking about the various parts of the armory, the Cult Arcana or Prospering Arcana, these different things, and we really want to go more in depth on the characters and the units. So what we'll probably do is we'll wrap up this one by just talking a little bit about maybe about modeling and hobby with the Thousand Suns. We should be able to do an army showcase in the near future of the Thousand Suns army. If you are a modeler or hobbyist at heart like I am, there's just so much potential with this Legion. I mixed in a ton of 40k bits. There's a lot of them that are very appropriate. The Scarab Occult Terminators, for example, are in Tartarus armor. They've already got the default weapons. You can't use them as SecMed, unfortunately, unless your gaming group doesn't care about such things. But they absolutely become a great basis for making either regular Tartarus squads or command squads. Using the Rubik Terminator, or excuse me, the Rubik Marine box for the Chaos Space Marines in 40k. I've used that as a basis for command squad, for veteran sergeants. The torsos mix in very well on regular Mark IV Marines. You can do lots of different things. So you can even use Tomb King's bits, which I've mixed into the army for things like banners, using the Tomb King staffs and things like this. So there's just so much potential with this army in terms of modeling. You can even go in a lot of different directions if you want to make them late Heresy and more on that angle, or you want to keep them more clean, early Heresy, pre-burning of Prospero, where maybe they don't have so much, decoration and arcane glyphs and these different kinds of things. So really, it's a modeler's army, don't you think?
I do. It's one of the legions, especially for the Hereticus side of things, where 40k have accentuated everything that happened at the end of 30k. Some more levels than others. For instance, I wouldn't use too many of the 40k Night Lord bits unless you're playing really late era Heresy Night Lords. But there's very little corruption that goes on in the 40k Thousand Suns where they're too demonified that make them inappropriate for the 30k setting there. So yeah, modeler's dream here, where also the thing is, it's not too hard to just use the base boxes we have in Age of Darkness with a few small trinkets added here and there, either from a bit of 3D printing for a couple heads or just trinkets from the actual 40k boxes and tacking those onto your models to really get the aesthetic of the Thousand Suns.
Yeah, absolutely. And when mixing in the 40k stuff, probably the only thing just to watch out for is there are a lot of Tzeentch glyphs that you will see on pieces of armor or the staffs or things like this. So in my case, I actually either cut, modified, or removed a lot of those just because I didn't want the army to be leaning too far into chaos just yet. But yeah, absolutely. Almost all the 40k stuff is quite usable as long as you stay away from the mutations and things like that. Although you could actually make a case for adding a few heavily mutated models to your army, because if you actually read the Black novels, they talk about the Chain, which is the uncontrollable mutation that some Thousand Suns legionnaires would actually experience, where they basically explode into almost the equivalent of a mini chaos spawn or something like this. So yeah, knock yourself out, go a lot of different directions. And probably the last thing I would talk about in terms of the hobby side is you have a lot of freedom with Thousand Suns in terms of the red. I know the metallic red with gold scheme is a very popular one. I'm not a big fan of metallic schemes overall, which is why this one is actually done in more of a crimson red. But yeah, you have a lot of freedom on how you want to approach this from a painting perspective too.
Yep, definitely a lot of ways to paint the red here. I think the reason a lot of people go for the metallic red, it's a really simple color scheme, especially nowadays, quite quick with the contrast paints or some inks there on top of a lead belcher spray or any of your preferred metallic sprays you use on your miniatures. So it gives a different effect, I'd say. But I do personally prefer the more matte finish with some of the reds, the ones I've seen for what Jason has painted. They're very, very nice. But also just in general, because of the more Egyptian themed things, even the basing options, I've seen some very, very creative basing options, some temple bases or some ruins of temple bases, which can actually make a pretty standard model stand out, especially sergeants and things like this.
Yeah, it's a great shout out. I ordered the resin bases. Now I got mine from Troll Trader. They're actually made by Secret Weapon, and Secret Weapon I don't even think is in business anymore. They turned the license over to somebody. But Troll Trader still has a significant stock of one of their temple bases of the kind of ruined stuff, and it looks just amazing. I actually can't wait to get this army on the Army Showcase, because I think it's going to be something that people are really going to enjoy, and something that I'm incredibly happy to have and get the opportunity to play.
Well, look, guys, that's it for part 1 of the Thousand Sons Legion review. We'll be back next week with part 2, where we will be looking at the units and the Primarch, and having a more in-depth discussion on that. So I hope you enjoyed what we've done so far for the Thousand Sons. If there are things or combinations, and I'm sure there are combinations, that we may have overlooked into how powerful the Thousand Sons are if you're a Thousand Sons player, let us know in the comments. We're always happy to have a discussion down there, get some user engagement, and we play a lot of legions here at Far East Wargaming, but we're not a master of too many of them. I'd say Jason is a master of a couple because they're his core legions. I'm a master of 1, maybe 2, but Thousand Sons are definitely very flavorful.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep those comments coming, the likes, subscribe, all that jazz. We really appreciate it. We do enjoy the feedback, and we do enjoy interacting with you. And yeah, looking forward to getting more games with the Thousand Sons on the channel and that Army Showcase. But as always, we will catch you on the next one.